Trustee Chin, we're ready to go.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, for attending our Saturday afternoon studies special meeting. We are going to start this meeting now at 1:07 p.m. with roll call. Oh, and here's actually President Corzo just came on. So why don't we pass the baton back to President Corzo.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
And President Corzo, translation has been set up.
I knew she was having computer issues, so I'll start with the roll call. So Trustee Proctor?
Here.
Trustee Hitchcock?
Yes, here.
Trustee Watkins?
Yes, here.
I am here as well. I know President Corzo was having some technical difficulties, but she is here as well. So roll call statements. We're moving on to statements, or I'm sorry, approval of agenda. We need a motion to approve this agenda.
Motion to approve today's agenda.
I'll
Thank
second.
you. Thank you, Trustee Watkins, for the first motion and Trustee Hitchcock for the second. Roll call vote. Trustee Hitchcock?
Yes.
Trustee Proctor?
Yes.
Trustee Watkins?
Yes.
President Corzo, are you here to vote for the agenda?
I'm here and I think I'm all good now. Sorry,
Okay.
I've been having lots of IT issues here. But yeah.
Do you want to
So
just vote yes on the approval of the agenda, and then once
Yes.
we do this, I will pass it back to you. Yes, so I will vote as well. Yes. So the approval of the agenda is approved, and we're on statements. President Corzo, you can go ahead and take over. Yes.
Actually, could we
Thank you.
pause a moment, and President Corzo, would you mind announcing that translation services are available by using that interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen?
Sure. Tenemos servicios de traducción disponibles. Si empuja un botón que está abajo de la pantalla, dice interpretación o en inglés interpretation, va a estar disponible toda la reunión. Gracias.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to public statements. Public statements related to agenda items. Persons will be called on. Can you all hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, persons will be called on. Wait, please limit statements to 3 minutes. I'm sorry, I lost my screen again. So, do we have any public? Hello?
To our attendees, if you'd like to make public comment on an agenda item, please use the raise your hand functionality in Zoom at this time. President Corzo, there's no, there's no raised hands at this time.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to our proposed consent agenda. All items on the consent agenda are considered by the board to be routine and will be enacted by the board in one motion in the form listed below. There will be no discussion on these items prior to the time the board votes on the motion unless members of the board, staff, or public request specific items be removed and discussed from the consent agenda. The superintendent and staff recommend approval of all consent items. Movement of any recommended consent item is appropriate at this time.
Absent any public member requesting to pull the item, I'll make the motion to approve the consent agenda.
Thank you. Do I have a second? 1 second. Thank you. Roll call vote. Trustee Chin,
Yes.
Trustee Hitchcock,
Yes.
Trustee Proctor. Yes. Trustee Watkins. Yes. And a yes from me, the motion carries. Moving on to our effective governance with equity lens study session.
All right, well, thank you for coming together this afternoon. This is our opportunity to continue our work from last study session, to learn together, to discuss equity work in our district, and consider next steps. So we are very pleased to have Nicole Anderson here to work with us through this process today. And I would invite her to go ahead and get us started.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you again. Everybody doing okay, yes?
Mhm.
Yes. Am I in the right Zoom room? Are we here to talk about equity in education? Do I have the right link? Okay, had to make sure. I know you all are still basking in your break you had a week ago, right? And you're like, wow, thank you, it's another weekend, is what I'm sure you're thinking. And also thinking like, wow, how did we magically plan this study session on this weekend? Because I'm sure if you're feeling like I'm feeling, you have some level of fatigue maybe in your body, but also even mentally, because there's a lot going on. I mean, face it, we're battling a couple things that are historical, just 2 pandemics, right? Like COVID-19 and this thing called racism, which has been around for quite some time. And it's exhausting. I don't know about you, but it's exhausting. And sometimes we actually need days like today on a Saturday where we can have some what I call good study session time to collaborate together and to be able to plan. And although it's a formal board meeting, I still want you all to consider this time a little less formal, but more time to collaborate as a team so that you can really prioritize your work. Because this is going to be long-standing work beyond just this year. This is work you'll be doing and creating a legacy and a culture in the district for years to come. So having today is really critical so that you can just kind of bring in some of the things that you've been doing, because you've been doing a lot, and just really bring them in and focus so you can be good at a few things and excellent at even one thing, like let's close an equity gap in San Mateo Foster City for good, eliminate it. And that requires a lot of hard work. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. You all received your packet, yes, and some of it are documents that you actually have seen before. And I'm going to refer back to them as I think it's important to go back to it. So I will refer to the water system change article today. I'll refer to the racial equity detours article by Dr. Paul Gorski. And then also your board assessment document, which is just a 1-pager about the 8 characteristics of effective boards. So I'll refer to those 3 documents. And then of course, Joan will have some time on the agenda as well for us to look at some resources around prioritizing the work of the district and around all your initiatives, your equity focused work, and also the role of staff in this process. So before we jump in, I'm going to be following what I call the detailed agenda. So you also should have received that version, which just kind of helps you see kind of the flow we're going to go today. And we're going to do our best to stay in those time frames. But again, this is your time. So I want to make sure that you know that we can kind of move as needed based on what the need of the group is. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference the slides. And I am not sure if Anna saw these in the folder or not. So I apologize, but what I'm going to do is just share this link now just so you all can have it. If I even can have access to the chat, which I don't think I see it there. So Joan, just so you know, it's in the folder if you all want to have access to that in terms of the slides I'm going to share right now. Okay, it won't allow me to share. All right. So sit back, try to relax a little bit, get comfortable, talk a little bit about prioritizing our work. And I want you to really be encouraged by all that you've been doing. You know, it's been tough. You all been beat up a little bit, right, by the community. There's been some things that people are serious about and they're concerned about. People want the schools reopened. Others are freaking out, like me as a parent, like, I don't know if I'm sending my kids back to school. You know, the whole new wave of this thing called COVID. There's a lot going on. And I want to say, you know, be encouraged by the fact that sometimes what we call these storms that happen in education actually are ways, just like in this particular quote, it goes back a ways, as storms do make trees take deeper roots. So what I want you to think about is this is an opportunity. Anytime you have challenges around equity work, think about it as an opportunity for growth and to take deeper roots into the work that you want to do. And sometimes those opportunities are actually come in the form of challenges. So we don't want to ever waste any challenges. We want to use them as opportunities to grow. In our work, I want to remind you of our 4 agreements. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. At this time of, I would say, moment in education, I'm noticing that after George Floyd's murder months back, that there was a lot of energy to address racism, specifically around school police, around just policing in communities. And there's been that energy where now organizations have really taken efforts, even like your district, to really do some intentional work. But what I'm finding about now is that now that people are starting to unpack the layers of oppression and all these different equity issues, there's becoming what I call a little bit of confusion. And the confusion is the difference between safety and comfort in doing this work. Like, that's the confusion. And I want y'all to be mindful of that, even as you work together, that this work is going to require discomfort. Okay, it's going to require discomfort because you're interrupting a system, remember? And I want to remind you that in interrupting any system, somebody's going to feel uncomfortable, but we always want to make sure that safety is intact. So people in this work should not feel that they're being attacked or feel that they're being judged or feel that they don't have a place in this work. And that's a really hard one because sometimes we're all in different journeys, right? And some are going faster than others, some have more awareness than others. And we have to make sure as equity leaders that we recognize if we're going to lead this work, we have to create safety for our stakeholders to move along with this. So as a governance team, I want you to be thinking about that this work may not feel safe to everyone. Some people who have less power, just because we're a governance team, right? We have power in itself. People may actually not feel they have a place to even come and say, hey, I have a concern or I feel inequitable, these inequitable outcomes for my kids. Even though as a board, we're like, hey, we want to reach out to diverse stakeholders, right? We want to hear your voices. We did these listening sessions, right? But you'd be amazed that still there are people who are still trying to figure this out. Like, where do I fit in all this? So it's always going to be important to recognize people have to feel safe in order to move forward in this work. And so the confusion will be, though, that some will feel that they're uncomfortable, therefore they're unsafe. And you're going to have to be mindful of that as a governance team, because there are going to be moments you're going to have to push back to the community and say, are you unsafe or are you uncomfortable? Because this work interrupts privilege and interrupts all kinds of things that have been set in place for a long time. So the 4 agreements is, again, a great way to think about, again, as a governance team, as you're working together, think about how do we agree to stay engaged? How do we encourage our community to stay engaged, even when it gets uncomfortable and we agree to be okay with a little discomfort? How do we agree to speak our truth, knowing that our truth may be different from someone else's? Those are going to be things that have to be constantly reiterated. But most critically, the hardest part of this work is the non-closure, right? Like, you're going to leave this board meeting today and you're going to be like, God, we still have so much work to do. Your community is going to feel this at times, like, wait, I need this taken care of, or we feel a certain way. Your kids are going to feel like this. They're going to say, hey, you had a listening session, and then you're going to do another one. Okay, now you heard our voices. Now what are you going to do about it, right? There's all these different versions of non-closure. So it's important that we recognize that these 4 agreements are a really great way to come back to over and over, and don't skip this step in your work. Because if there's not foundation of safety, this work won't last very long. And I'm seeing that right now as we speak with lots of folks who are engaged in this work. There's like this, am I safe or am I comfortable? And it's like, let's talk about it. And sometimes the 4 agreements is a great way to regroup folks. I just want to share that and see if there are any questions or thoughts about your 4 agreements. Are you all still good with these? Questions, thoughts about these? Because I want to make sure you're reminded of the moment in time that people are really starting to get stuck right now. And they're starting to be this like, uncomfortable, unsafe, a little bit of confusion. So we got to keep wrestling with it. And this is a great way to revisit. Questions or thoughts on this? Good. All right, cool. Let's keep it moving. All right, so I want to ask you all, this is a little bit of board discussion. So I want to open this up for you to think about this. One of the things that's really important that I want you all to think about is I've worked with you this last year and a half or so, whether individually or collectively. One of the things I want you to reflect on today is your common vision. Like, do we have common vision together? As you recall, one of the 8 characteristics of effective boards is having a common shared vision and like beliefs about the work that you want to do around equity. So in leading for educational equity, I want you to be thinking about, okay, yes, we all are on the same page, right? Some of you may think of it that way. Some of you may think of it as common vision of like, yeah, we're all about this particular resolution or this decision. We voted 5-0, like you might think of common vision in that way. Okay, but however it sits for you, I want you to look at these 3 images for a minute. And I'm just going to ask you to think about which one of the 3 resonates with you the most when you think about our governance team leading for equity and how it connects to our common vision around this work. So just which one resonates with you the most? Okay, so I want you to think about it. And I just want to open up for a little discussion, a little reflective discussion, kind of centering our work around our common vision for leading for equity at the board. But each of you individually, I want you to pick one that resonates with you the most. So go ahead and unmute yourself once you're ready to share, and just share which one resonates the most with regards to.
Share.
Okay, go ahead, Nadia.
I think the one that resonates the most for me is the quote by John Lewis. I think because I haven't actually read it before. And I think it's something that can easily be forgotten. Like we think sometimes that like, you know, the work is just like, that we just need our allies and we just need to push and push and push. But in reality, like I do think, you know, it takes a lot of forgiveness and moving forward and moving past it. And you know, we believe in education, and that means that we believe that people can learn and then act accordingly or change, you know, their future decisions with the new information they have.
Powerful. Okay. I appreciate that, Nadia. That's powerful. Anyone else want to jump in? Which one resonated? Go ahead, Ken, jump in.
Yeah, actually, I chose the same one.
Okay.
You know, just going off of the change, the idea that, you know, people, and like John Lewis, you know, maybe they might have done something early on when they were in their 20s or 30s. And then as they're changed and as they're educated, as they experience different things, you know, you can't in some ways hold them back to what they might have said or did way back when they might have actually changed. And so when we think about sort of everything that we talk about, you know, the idea is that we are all evolving and we're all changing. And so just because we might have said something, or maybe because a public member might have said something or whatever it is, you know, the idea is that we can all change and we can all move on and we can all sort of have to have that ability to sort of forgive and just and say like, okay, what is it right now, you know, and not look at the past.
Wow, I love that example. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so Ken Noel, you feel like the middle image really resonates, quote resonates. Jump in, Rebecca, Allison, Shara, you want to jump in?
I don't like to choose just one because I like all of them for different reasons. So choosing one is like the hardest thing for me to do.
I'm sorry.
So I'll just start with the first one.
Okay.
That one stands out to me because I think as a board, even though at the bottom it says who wants to lead the change and there's no one there, I think our board is there. And I think that's pretty powerful because usually there's nobody there.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a great reflection. Okay.
I chose the same one, I think for a little bit of different reasons. Yeah, I think this one just resonates for me because I think, you know, and actually the example, you know, kind of what you were sharing about at the beginning, Nicole, around just, you know, there was like all this energy around the work around policing, and then it really fizzled, right? And like we had a really hard time getting people to attend listening sessions, and you know, so I think it's like there's a burnout factor, or like we want these things to happen, but we don't have the time or the space or whatever to be able to do it. And so I think this work often ends up falling to just defaults to kind of core people. And I think a lot of times I found this both in our work, you know, in our district and just personal life, my own job, you know, day job, often falls to people of color to engage in this work because of the direct implications and ramifications on our personal lives in a way. So yeah, I think this one, as someone that takes on a lot of things, as we all do, it definitely resonated for me. Powerful.
I like that connection. I didn't always make the connections that way in terms of people of color leading the work in that perspective. So I just appreciate that. And it was connection to Paul Gorski's article, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but thank you for that, Shara. And for Rebecca. So Allison, what about you?
Yeah, I picked the first one too. And what resonated with me is that I think it's really easy to kind of stand up and say, yeah, I want to see change and I want that to happen. But you kind of see it fizzle out as you get to the next stage where you're asking, okay, who's going to change? And people kind of, okay, yeah. And then once you get to the point of like, who's going to lead the change, you really see where people's true colors are kind of. And I think that not only do we need to lead the change, but we need to kind of get other people on board. And it's just kind of you see it often where it's like, yeah, I'm ready, I'm into this, and then it tapers out.
Yeah, powerful. And Joan, I'm not sure if you're there. I know Joan had her dogs running around, getting in the way. Joan, are you still there? There you are. Did you want to jump in and share which one?
I'm absolutely with all of you. I've been listening very carefully. I also like the one that's the Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just because it says fight for the things you care about. But obviously you have to do it in a way that others understand and care about it too, and that you create a force together. So, I appreciated hearing what everybody had to say, and just think that one is powerful too.
Yeah. Powerful. Thank you all for sharing. What's interesting, and did I get everyone? Yeah, no, I got you. You went first. Yeah. And so what's interesting is how each of you have your own individual perspective, but yet collectively you all said something very similar, right? And it's all in the spirit of like, our vision is really common, right? Which I'm excited about for your board in particular, because you all have this sense of urgency to lead for equity, to focus on what is right. In particular, educational equity, because that's the context you're working in. But obviously, even as Shara mentioned, there's this personal intersection that happens as well. And so as you think about moving forward, I want you to think about, how do we remain in this space of having a common vision about equity in San Mateo, Foster City? Understanding that we have to lead the work. So the vision is we're leading this work, right? And that's what's going to be, really important as we move into our next piece about the role of the board, because leading for equity has to be a common space first. And when I think about just kind of a connection to the characteristics of effective boards, I want to give you a reminder about, what does that look like for you to take your common vision and actually think about, like, how do we govern with this equity lens, right? When we have this common equity lens, which is really important. And so I want to remind you of this fish analogy, remember, in the water system change, because this is a constant process of unpacking, like, what's water, right? Because what Shara said was very powerful, which someone else may not understand because they're not leading from the same space as Shara. And then what each of you kind of said in terms of, okay, like Joan said, I really like the Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote, because it's really about fighting for the things you care about, right? It's about my personal passion, right? And but yet I have to be reflective of how do I bring other people along who may not be on the same journey as me, right? Or maybe they do agree. And let me go back for a second. Maybe they do agree with me, but they don't quite understand just yet how that looks, right? And even that maybe someone may have evolved in their journey, right? And so when we talk about, like, how do we stay focused as a governance team to govern with an equity lens, I want you to be thinking today about how, as leaders in this work, you're going to constantly have to be in a space of recognizing there's some things I still don't know. There's a perspective I still understand, because each of you have positions of power, right? So I want to call that out, because when we have positions of power, what that does is that means we have the power, and I call it even privilege, to define what equity is in education for other people. So just that power alone means that when I'm leading, that means I have the privilege to set the tone and set the vision for this work, which is a good thing, right? That's a good thing. But then the struggle is, how do I bring people along knowing that if I have power, that may create some space, going back to the safety and comfort piece, right? That may create a lack of safety or even discomfort for people who don't have power. So I always want us to remember that, because when we start talking about our role as governance team and some of the barriers to this work, you got to remember we still have a lot we're still wanting to learn as a team. So when you think about your, you remember we did our board assessment, I want to say back in August, if I'm not mistaken. It's all kind of blurred now, right? But way back, we did our board assessment and you went through each of these. Actually, this was in June. And we went through this and we went through each one, and you all talked about like where we think we are as a board. And I want to just remind us, I'm doing this really quick, so I'm not going to go deep into this, but I want to remind us that with equity-driven work, we have to ensure that we have effective governance practices first. That is the foundation. So one that I want to pull out, which I appreciate you all participating in, is that second question about our board has strong shared beliefs and values about equity for students. That was the second one. And many of you, I think all of you actually, that was the one where you all chose that you're somewhat effective in that as a board. And so how powerful that is, because that means you're growing on your journey, but all of you agree, like this is where we're at on our journey of having a common shared belief. So as you continue to evolve your work, I want you to be thinking about all of these 8 characteristics. And when you all are having your study sessions, or when you're having a moment in time where there's a challenge, go back to this board assessment and just check yourselves on where are we at? Because remember, we're wanting to lead for equity. And we know that leading this work is going to have some challenges to it. So I want to just make that connection to, it's important to recognize the effectiveness of governance teams has to be established constantly, going back to that, so that you can effectively lead for equity in the long run. One other reminder, you all remember this slide? So this was a really good reminder, right? Where we talk about the role of the board, the role of superintendent, and obviously superintendent and designees, right? The staff is what we call it. And so just remembering, sometimes when we get stuck as well, go back to your reminder about what is our role in this, especially with equity work, because again, this is passionate work, right? This is people work. And sometimes we're going to want to do the work. And so this is the hard part for board members who lead for equity, right? So it's not a San Mateo Foster City thing. This is lots of boards who are super passionate about this work. And I have to remind the board members, like, time out, your role is just to operate above that blue dotted line, right? So you set the vision, right? You set policy, obviously, right? And then you even evaluate like how those policies are creating outcomes. But that dotted line is where that blurred space comes, because you do have to collaborate with your superintendent and staff, right? And so this is where sometimes the work gets really messy, and that we have to be okay with the messiness, but also, again, remind each other, okay, your role is here and my role is there. And so let's make sure that we establish those and revisit them so that you don't get into a space where effective governance gets in the way of equity work. And that's really important as your work evolves in your district from years to come. So this is always a good one to go back to, and recognizing, and we'll actually cover some of this in a moment about what the role of the staff is in regards to even your policies and your priorities you have, but recognizing that there is a clear distinction between governance teams in terms of the board trustees, right? Even if you've been an educator, even if you're super passionate about education, but there's still that very clear line that is existing, but it's dotted for a reason, right? And it's because we want to have a collaborative process. And what works for one board may not work for another. I just want to say that. So you create your own culture, right, of how you communicate with each other, right? Your processes and procedures, which we're going to go through in a little bit. But I want to just remind you, it's important to go back to this, to remember effective governance is super important when we're leading for equity. Questions or thoughts about this? I just kind of quick recap, so I didn't want to go too deep. All right, perfect. All right, so you all remember this slide. I've shared this quite a bit with the Equity Task Force, because one of the things that's important is we take some time to really talk about what it means to address equity in education. And some of it is just, okay, let's keep unpacking, like, what are we aware of? How deep can we go? So today I want to go a little bit deeper into not just what equity means. I think you all have that pretty down pat, right? Like I don't have to, it's like preaching to the choir. You know what equity means. And I think the one thing I want to reiterate to you is that what equity means is now you're going to have to teach others, right? So when I say, what does equity mean? How are you going to take that equity statement you have and actually apply it to some of the language you're using and teaching others what equity is? Okay, so I know you know what equity means, but what we also got to understand is that middle column is what are the barriers to this work? Okay, so what are the barriers to your equity work is something we're going to have to unpack in a second. And then of course, the last column is about what are our actions. And that's where we're going to talk about prioritizing our work, looking at our policies, and also creating a plan of action, which is part of what your equity task force is working on now. So that's the good piece about this work. Okay, but what I want to unpack is the first couple of columns with you. Okay, what does equity mean? So this is a lot of times we like to share with the community. I like using this particular visual for our community members who are watching, because community members are still trying to figure out what does equity actually mean, and what it looks like in one person's family based on one person's experience could be very different from another. And so as a governance team, I want to remind you of the whole elephant and blind man piece. Okay, is while you have adopted a statement, right, and the statement is kind of like, it's the elephant, right? The reality is that everybody has a different perspective based on their experiences, and what you feel may be equity, and focusing on something like race or like special education, right, or language, it could be very different depending on who your stakeholders are. And so just know that this process of doing equity work is kind of like the elephant and blind man process. And one of the recommendations I'm going to make to the board is using your equity statement. You may want to continue to get input from your community about what equity means to them and what your statement means to them, because you've already adopted a statement. And so be open to knowing that once you get more feedback, you may actually want to amend your statement. You may want to adjust it to make it really fit your community, if that makes sense. Okay. So, and I have your statement here actually on the screen. So the community is reminded too. So this is always a really good one. I actually use this your statement quite a bit. I know it's adopted by the National Equity Project out of Oakland. And one of the things that's powerful about your statement is it not only calls out what equity is, but it also calls out kind of actions associated with it, right? And what that outcome might look like if equity exists. So I always like to revisit it, and I want you to make sure you remember what you said equity was as a board. Because when your community is asking, or when they're pushing back, right, or they're unsure of what it is, when we say equity, this is what we mean. Now I'm going to ask you a question. When you think about your equity statement, how have you applied it to your governance work thus far? So maybe give me an example, because I think it's important to think about, if we say this is equity, then this is our lens, and how do we apply this lens to our governance work? So does anyone have an example of how you may have applied this equity statement to your governance work? Anyone jump in? Give me an example.
For the interrupting inequitable practices, we had, fee-based preschool and subsidized preschool, and the fee-based preschool, I think the teachers got paid more, and something about I'm so sorry, I'm brain farting. It's Saturday, but it was something where the subsidized preschool, whether it was curriculum or child teacher ratio, and definitely teacher salary, was, didn't receive the same as the fee-based.
Got it.
Rebecca is correct.
So it sounds like you're calling out where we have interrupted an inequitable practice, and that's based on income levels, that those who needed it the most got that particular barrier removed. So great example, excellent example. Anyone else have an example of how you've applied your equity statement to your work?
I think one of the big pieces of work that's been done has been the work around English learners, and it's not necessarily an interruption. It's making sure that the graphic that you show with the fence, that the kids have the right level of boxes so that they can see, so that they can participate. So it's been a multi-year project. That's a big one for our district.
Okay. Go ahead, Noelia.
I've immediately, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I thought I heard Noelia, but go ahead, jump in, Shar. I wasn't sure if I heard Noelia or Shar, so apologies if I missed it.
Go ahead, Noelia.
Okay. I was gonna say, yeah, like I think, you know, the creation of the task forces that we have created, I'll speak to like the sanctuary task force and you know, the deep dive into like our enrollment process and the way in which, you know, there are barriers there for people. Also, you know, we did update our mission and vision and had that centered around equity, and then shared with our entire district. So.
Got it.
I was going to say those exact same too. So awesome. Great
Okay,
minds
you
think
can't
alike.
Shar. You got to give me another one. Give me another one.
Oh man, I don't.
I got baby
You
brain.
got to cut me a little bit of slack. You got to cut me a little bit of
No,
slack.
I'm totally joking with you. No, those are great examples of, and I appreciate it, because one of the reasons why I asked this question is as y'all continue to work together, this lens, right, AKA your equity statement, is what you should always be using to make decisions. Any decision, right? And that's powerful. Go ahead, Joan.
I do think that if David would want to jump in here, he would want to say something about just the work that's been going on throughout the entire organization to improve core curriculum and instruction.
Got it.
Because I don't think we've ever been as on point together by grade level across the district about what we're doing. And that's been a tremendous amount of work, bringing in new materials, new instructional strategies, the addition of TOSAs, the addition of the counselors, a counselor at every single school. I mean, there's untold work, I mean, throughout the organization that everyone's been involved in, every single person. So, I mean, everybody holds a different piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah, David, you have something to add? How have we applied this amazing equity statement to the work?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Well, I do think, I mean, the board's support for our effort to say that, you know, more equitable outcomes begin in first instruction with the tier 1 work that we do, and making sure that we have the right resources, that we have well-trained teachers, that all of that work is where we do make important equity differences. I would also add that the board has, at least over the last few years, as I've been in the district, has been approving SIPSA budgets, which reflect an equitable approach to budgeting and staffing. For example, our Title I schools have, frankly, more FTE around language and literacy TOSAs and math TOSAs and additional counseling staff. So that pushing of, you know, different and additional resources out to sites where we know that the equity needs are great, would be another point that I would add to Joan's points.
Excellent. Yeah, David, thank you for that. And each of you, you know, for adding to like, how do you apply this equity statement? One of the things that we just did, even in front of the community, is you just got through communicating the work you're doing. And I think just what you did was just really a little over 5 to 6 minutes long, right? And what you did is you actually communicated your vision, which is common, right? You're all on the same page. This is what we say equity is as a district, and this is how we're applying that lens. And that in itself, as a community member, if I heard that from my board, right, of my kids' school, that would give me a sense of, okay, I see where the work is happening. I see why this is, you know, such a challenge in this area. I'm starting to understand it, right? And the more I hear you talk about this outwardly, the more I start to believe the work as well, the more I start to understand the work. The more that water piece we were talking about, right? The what's water? Because there's some community members who are like, I don't understand what that equity thing means. What do you mean you're removing the predictability of success or failure of kids? There are people who don't not necessarily, I don't even say believe, they just don't understand because it's not a reality for them. So the more you communicate in the way you just did and being reflective even amongst yourselves to feel more comfortable with like, yeah, that's equity. That's where I saw equity. That's where we're applying this work. That's how this work continues to move forward, where it doesn't fizzle away because of some other priority that comes up, right? Or some other crisis that comes up. But as a board, how do you keep this, I call it equity on the agenda, what you just did. Very short process, but it helps to stay really focused on what the work is and communicating to your stakeholders. I want you to appreciate that, but also recognize where that can be valuable. So here's what I want to do as well. In our last piece of just kind of thinking about this thing called equity, I want you to reflect a little bit on some of the barriers to this work. So many of you are super excited. You have common vision for this work. Like, this is the right work you can do. This is the work of education. This is our moral imperative. However, there are some barriers to the work, right? And I know in our last session together, several of you talked about how this particular article resonated with you around addressing some of the work specifically because we've recently talked about racial equity. So again, going back to that elephant blind man poem, right, is that some people would say equity work in San Mateo Foster City is about language. And we have to honor and respect that, right, and value that perspective. But also there will be a part of the community that will say, you know, this is about race. This is about that divider, right? This is about that piece where we say people are different based on their skin color, based on their ethnicity, based on all these different things that our students, by the way, spoke so well about in those student forums. But this particular article calls out a couple of things, and I want to just kind of go back to this particular article and ask you to, I don't know if y'all have it in front of you. Do y'all have it right in front of you handy? Okay, I didn't want to pull it up on the screen because it's, as you know, too wordy. But I want to have you go to, there were particularly 4 detours that Dr. Paul Gorski talked about. And detours, if you think about it, I call them distractions. Sometimes I'll call them convenient excuses on why we're going to stop the work, right? Because you all, for those of you who've been in education for a while, you've seen initiatives come and go, and this is not one of those that we want to allow that to go. But this is the one that's the easiest to stop because, again, race and even the work of equity is something that is we've been taught it's very uncomfortable and it's not the natural flow of work. So in a school district or in any organization. So I want to bring you to a particular one that really has resonated with me recently. And it's actually on page, let's see, why is mine not numbered? We'll just go to the second page. It's actually page 57. I don't think there's a 57 on it. And the first racial equity detour where it talks about pacing for privilege. So I just want to call something out. And in particular, this particular one, I want to go to the second paragraph where it says professional development in these schools appears designated to accommodate the feelings and fears of white educators in difficult conversations about race, rather to advance equity for students of color. I want to just pause because that particular statement is pretty tough to unpack when we just out the gate, let's talk about the barriers. But here's why I say it, because what do I do for a living? I do professional development, and it just happens to be around equity. And then people want to magically talk about race, and race is one of many things under the umbrella of equity, by the way. But I want to ask you about this because professional development is one of the recommendations, right, that you're given as a board to prioritize your resources, your time. You've obviously prioritized it by having my team work with you. But I want you to think about what detours may come or you may have seen when you think about this concept of professional development, accommodating the fears or feelings, and this goes back to our 4 agreements, right? That safety and discomfort. In particular, it calls out white educators. And I want to give context to white means. Okay, remember we talked about this before, is that when we talk about the census data, right? People who don't mark the box white, or I think it says Caucasian, but remember we're talking about race, not cultural identity. So I want to just be very clear, race versus cultural identity, ethnicity, because there are many educators who may mark the box white, but identify based on their European ancestry or their different ancestry that may be what we call multicultural, multi-ethnic. Okay, so in this concept of white, it's referring to whiteness meaning power structures, right? Privilege to have access to services and experiences that may provide benefits versus disadvantages. Okay, so I want to be clear about that piece. So I want to just open it up a little bit about what resonates with you about that particular detour, because that is one that's happening right now in lots of districts, lots of organizations, and I'm a living witness of it based on being a consultant where I have been asked to kind of adjust what content I share, adjust what information is shared because of feelings of fear, maybe lack of safety, lack of comfort. So tell me a little more about what resonates with you about that particular detour.
This one is one that like stood out to me immediately in the context of this article. Is actually something I shared again, like because I feel like it talks about in the context of professional development, but it's much more expansive than that, right? And I think about that actually a lot in terms of companies that are working on, you know, DEI kind of initiatives, and what you want to address or how quickly you want to go, or and then who that means kind of you're prioritizing in terms of comfort and prioritization. And just, it makes me think about the quote around like, if you're silent, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. Like you actually have to kind of prioritize certain voices and certain comfort, because the default is to prioritize is not to prioritize that, right? And to move at a pace and to do things in a way that makes it comfortable for the majority, or comfortable for kind of the systemic, just the way the systems always function. And that's in education, and that's outside of education. And so I think it's a really important thing to consider as you approach a variety of initiatives.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Powerful. Anyone want to add to what Shara shared? Go ahead, Alison.
I can add one thing. Yes, actually what Shara said, it like when I was reading this section, it was actually reminding me of my own work that I, like the company that I work for and the things that we're doing. But I wrote down a note where a quote from this where it said, students, families, and educators experiencing racism cannot afford to wait for us to saunter towards a more serious racial equity vision. And so to me, this paragraph is, or this section is just saying that we can't just wait till everybody feels comfortable, and really we need to cater to the actual issue at hand, and not making sure that everyone in the room is feeling good before they can dive into this work.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. Way to call that one out too. Yeah, other thoughts about this particular one?
I was going to comment that it's sort of like just checking the box.
Yeah.
You know, it's basically the organizations are saying, oh yeah, we're doing this, we're just checking the box.
Right.
And it's not really necessarily maybe moving the needle. It kind of reminds me of actually the other example. It's in, I think it's number 4, which was that cultural diversity in the high school example of the diversity day.
Yeah.
And the thought is, well, really, it's not just for to really sort of improve diversity or educate diversity. It's making people comfortable in some ways. And so that's where thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. Powerful one to call out. Diversity is definitely the detour of what diversity means, even unpacking that word. Keep going. Keep going.
I think for me, this I'm just thinking about like actual situations that we have faced in our work where, you know, as a board, we have, you know, we have shared our vision, we have made statements, we have made decisions, and, you know, they're not always taken super well. And I think that's like just a natural part of the process, right? Like we're like, this is what we need to do. And yet, I don't know, I just think about like, sorry, I'm like struggling with my words, but so I'm thinking about like the moments where we've done that and where there's been conflict, yet like we still move forward. And then I also think about the moments where like, where we kind of maybe have paused a bit. And I think like in a way, like it's really important to know the difference between like, okay, we can pause just for a little bit because it won't like this thing needs to change now. This thing we can wait a little bit, and like that balance. But yeah, it's a hard line to walk.
Yeah, sure is. Yeah.
I will just say one other thing that it kind of based on that and just some of the other things that are said, I think it can be hard. And I know for me, sometimes I struggle with kind of how that intersects with kind of like the safety discomfort piece, right? Like there is this kind of fine line there. And so just, that's just something to, I don't know, I guess acknowledge, right? That when you're pushing these things forward, as you mentioned, inevitably there's discomfort. And so when does that become, like when does that enter into territory where it's unproductive? But when do you move, I don't know, when do you move forward anyways, because you need to, because we're thinking about kids first and foremost, right? So I think that those are things that, I mean, it's why this work is challenging and it gets a little bit messy, but I do think these things sometimes seem to, not that they contradict one another, but they are, I don't know, just need to grapple with them.
Like they can both be true in certain situations.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Anyone else want to share? Anything that resonates?
I was trying to find the words because, you know, I'm just so good at them. But Allison pretty much said my thoughts, which were the comfortability level, and like we shouldn't have to wait for people to be comfortable with making some pretty intense topic to discuss and make changes. And then at Shara's with uncomfortable versus unsafe, and kind of like where that line, how uncomfortable does one have to be before maybe, you know, and just where that line is.
Yeah. Any other thoughts anyone wants to share? Okay. Yeah, this one, this article really, between this and the water system change, I use these two often to create a dialogue about this work. And so one of the things, if you go back to even page 58, there's this large quote at the top about, and because I use these words sometimes, that this piece about the hard truth is that racial equity cannot be achieved with an obsessive commitment to meeting people where they are. And I say that often, when where they are is fraught with racial bias and privilege, right? And so this is important because even as a facilitator of this work, as a woman of color, going back to that quote of, from John Lewis, right? Like often I will find myself in that space of recognizing that I do have to meet people where they are. If I want to lead this work, right, then I have to recognize that some people just aren't where I am. And that's hard because for you all are a governance team, right? And there's 5 people who have to collaborate with superintendent and staff to bring all these people along. When I say these people, meaning the community who has never really deeply engaged with intentionality in this type of work, right? Like we've grown up in societies where the narrative is this is just how we do school, right? And so why would we do anything different? We're talking about changing mindsets of people like teachers, right? Who this is how we've always taught. Why would I do anything differently? And by the way, if I have benefited from this system, what you're telling me is you're trying to change it and take it away from me. Now, I'm saying that that is a very real experience for lots of people who may not even just identify by marking a box white or Caucasian or any box outside of those boxes that we traditionally call diversity, we call people of color. Okay, I want you to recognize that even people of color and even people who have not who have experienced inequities will also push back on this because they have been taught the same concepts. So this is where, if any of you notice, there's communities that may not be in support of even the movement that's for them, right? That's the part that's so tricky about, is that I want to help you. But remember, what's water? What do you mean there's an inequity? This is how life has always been. You mean to tell me you want to interrupt microaggressions on my campus that I've heard from other kids who have made comments about my hair, my skin tone, and you want to come and interrupt those things, right? But if you interrupt them, then that means you're putting me on the spot. And now that means you're going to have me now have to defend myself based on what you're interrupting. Or I'm a parent, right? And I'm on a transfer and I'm in your district. And I don't want you to bring up anything because I just want to be here and fly under the radar. But you want to create like this space where you want to interrupt the inequities that have been burdening my family for a long time, which is part of why I even want to be in your district, right? On a transfer versus the district that's in my neighborhood. That's the hard part of this work. When I go back to that quote, meeting people where they are, it's not always just about people who have privilege and who may benefit from racism and benefit from inequity in the system. It could actually be people who have been marginalized and oppressed, right? And that's the part that's so hard about this work. So when I say meet people where they are, what I mean is that if I'm going to lead for equity, wherever someone is, whether I'm asking them to lead with me, or I'm actually trying to advocate for them and I want to empower them with information, I have to start with figuring out where they are. So there's this readiness piece that we have to think about, right? Like, although we have a common vision, we want to do this work in San Mateo, Foster City, is our community ready? And that's where you have to think about doing an ongoing assessment of what equity again even means to your community. And so when you look at these detours, what happens a lot of times is those detours sometimes are because our own levels of lack of safety or lack of comfort or lack of readiness to do the work. So one of the things that I share with folks as a way to think about how to avoid some of these things is, don't do that. I'm almost hung up on you all. One way to do so is to think about, okay, so I know these barriers exist, right? There's this deficit ideology Dr. Gorski talks about, right, around stereotypes, around these narratives that have been taught. And we think more negatively about kids who might be English learners, where we think, okay, you don't speak the dominant English culture, English language, so therefore there's a deficit thinking we have, which creates it's within our psyche around implicit bias about who doesn't speak English. But then there's also this piece around, like, we don't have more of an asset-based thinking first. So some of the detours in themselves are that we have this mindset that kids have less, so we start to feel bad for them. We start to have this maybe a level of empathy, but then we lower our expectations. So this is also something that could be a detour in our classrooms. We start to say, okay, I recognize kids have needs, but we think of it as they have needs, so they're less than, right? And that has to be really, really addressed in our professional learning. It's not kids are less than, they just have different needs than others. So we don't want to lower expectations, which is what we often have seen in education too, where now we start to teach differently in our classrooms. Right? We start to address needs in a whole different way because we have a mindset of we haven't quite understood what this work actually is about because we haven't learned people's full story. One of the pieces that I wanted to bring back when I brought up the part about the fear and feelings of white educators. Some of you may have been familiar with a very popular book from Robin DiAngelo about the white fragility. You may have heard that come up quite a bit. And lots of different terminology. One of the ways that I would really recommend that educators think about this, and for any of our community members who are teachers and staff that are trying to figure out how to lead this work, is we have to spend more time addressing people's cultural identity. The one thing that I realize is the biggest detour to this work is that we have not been taught very clearly that racism has harmed everybody. I'll say that again, racism has harmed everybody. And so what we don't want to do is play what we call oppression Olympics, right? Like who got oppressed the most based on racism. Like if we played that game, I'm sure there's some people who would lose, there's some people who would win, right? But that's not it either. But racism is a tool that was used to divide a group of people. So if we don't do things like even unpack the words we're using, like white, people of color, right? When we say Asian American students, like what does that actually mean? Because all kids aren't the same, they're not monolithic. And so we have to make sure that in our professional development, that whoever you hire to do your professional development work, whether it's for curriculum adoption, it's through PBIS work, whether it's the equity work, whatever it is, that you're very clear as a board that, look, I want to make sure you understand that we're going to have to unpack some of these barriers to the work that we're doing, where racism has paralyzed our educators, which therefore paralyzes now what the work can be done that we're actually trying to do as a board. Okay, so it's important for people to be able to unpack who people are, what is their identity, and not just kind of stick with some of those key words that just make people stay at the surface, right? So let's talk about what people's ethnicity is. Let's start to be more comfortable with that. I've actually, with clients, have started to do introductions where we actually have asked people to not only share their name and how they pronounce it based on how it should accurately be pronounced, but also share your ethnicity or your cultural identity. Whew, that's uncomfortable. Why? Because racism has harmed everybody. Because we've been taught that we have to identify a certain way. Some people are so uncomfortable that I'm not sure what I am. I don't even have a culture. Like those kind of things hurt me, because we all have a beautiful identity that we have to know who we are first. So here's where I want to go with this, because we're going to go into our prioritizing of our work, but I want to make sure we have some context on the concept of what equity is in education and some of the barriers. And one way to address it is, remember your article, water system change. The purpose of that article is to really highlight how you are going to help people really change not only practices and policies, and also shifting resources, which is all that structural stuff that boards focus on, which is super important. But again, just like when we did our history of public education, right? Remember some of those great policies that changed, right? So we have opportunities now we didn't have before. I want you to remember that some of those policies did no good, because at the bottom of that system change, inverted triangle is mental models, the belief systems, my mindset, my narrative. If I don't believe that every kid should have access to free preschool, then how does that actually play out in implementation? And that was what governance teams have to figure out, is how do we address this as a systems approach versus just let's change a policy and voila, equity is going to happen in the district. So we have to remember in our action steps, we're going to have to address other parts of the system, which what I was excited about is you all had mentioned some of the ways you've applied your equity statement. And you'd mentioned like we've empowered task force, right? You got your sanctuary task force, your equity task force. You have another task force, it just lost me. Your is it around special education?
CDEC, the special education.
Yeah, yep. And those are ways you've empowered your community to come together to weigh in on some of this work. Having your teacher union be at the table to talk about how are we going to advance equity moving forward is very important. Right? I got to give a shout out to our teachers and our principals. You know who has to do this work? Talk about implementation and go back to that, the blue line, right? You know, has to do this work? Your principals and your teachers. The governance team, you sit really in that space, right? And even as superintendent and designees at the district level, the work really happens with the kids. So that's why we have to ensure that we recognize where they fit in this too, that they have to be a part of this work as well. So giving them time to wrestle with what does this mean and how are they going to lead is important. So I want to give you that piece to remind you about that concept of how are we going to avoid some of these racial equity detours, is we got to approach it with a systems lens. And then the last piece is, let me see something. I think it skipped the slide. There it is. the last piece is a tool, and this is just a quick overview in terms of what we are going to be doing with your principal, your site leaders, your district leaders around professional learning, is to make sure that there's a jumping off point from the work that you did a couple years back with Dr. Trudy Arriaga. You may remember an amazing keynote speaker who's one of my mentors and colleagues, and she talked about that concept of opening doors, right? And so that was around the concept of cultural proficiency and being able to respond effectively to a variety of cultural settings. That means people's belief systems, right? And there's issues that come up when you have diversity, right? Diversity is a fancy word for differences. So being culturally proficient is where we want to provide that content to help our leaders who you're expecting as a board, you're expecting them to lead for equity. So this is actually the content we're going to utilize. And what I really love about it is it's a safe approach to opening the door for this work, which is what Dr. Arriaga talked about. And one of the things that we'll do with them is we'll show them a couple of tools. And here's one of the tools when you talk about readiness to advance this work. This is the continuum, and we're going to share this with them to help them understand how do we assess where we are in this journey, right? How do we meet people where they are when we have incidents or we have just kind of a system that represents these 6 spaces on the continuum. And this continuum really represents like, how do we recognize and then respond to differences, right? When cultural conflict happens, because that's what differences are, cultural conflict. And so what's amazing about this tool is that we actually have a chance to assess where we are now, where do we want to be, okay? And so I'm not going to go deep into this, but in a future study session, we can definitely continue to go deeper into the work that the administrators can be going through. And so as we get ready to transition into our prioritization, some of you are running like, where do we go from here, right? Like that's a lot, Nicole, in a short period of time. You know, Racial Equity Detours article is pretty deep actually. But one of the things that I want to always remind you of in leading this work is although you are individuals leading, right? You're 5 people on a board, but you lead as one. But the one thing we always remind people with this type of work is you always start with self first. It's an inside out approach, right? So we always look at ourselves first before we try to change other people. Sometimes we call it looking in the mirror before we look out the window, right? And then what I always love when I used to fly is reminding every time I got on the airplane about the work I was doing when the flight attendant would talk about when the oxygen pressure left the cabin, and they would always say, put your mask on first before you help somebody else. And I tell you, it's one of the most profound things I've heard when I make connections to leading this work. Is at all times I have to remember that I still am always unpacking what's in the water, what I may not know some things, but I got to make sure I'm good and I'm healthy before I can help other people. So that's the work we're doing as a board, which is what you're doing today, right? You're doing your own study session time, and the community has to know this is your way of putting your oxygen mask on first before you expect somebody else to do anything. So that's what I really appreciate about all of you. So here's what I'd like to do. I want to ask, do you need a quick stretch break? Because we have about 45 minutes, and we are going to spend the last part prioritizing our amazing work as a board. Your superintendent has some things she's going to share around what the work of the staff, how they're prioritizing the vision of the board, and talk about some next steps. So y'all need like 5-minute stretch break? No, Rebecca's like, I'm good, keep going. Okay, let me check with mommy to be. Do you need to relieve yourself at all, or just go and just stretch or something, get a back massage real quick? You good?
I can always just hop off for a second.
Okay, that's fair.
So
all
whatever
right,
works.
I gotta check in because after 3 children, I know that this is an interesting time in your life. So we just want to honor that and excited for you more than anything. All right, so let's keep moving on. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share a few slides, and this again, if you can just kind of switch your brain from, okay, we have our effective governance lens, we know we have common vision, we know what equity is, we know there's going to be some barriers to this work, and we reflected on like how we're going to be a part of this work. Who am I? Now let's talk about the technical stuff, which is really important. Let's talk about prioritizing our work as a team. And so in particular, I'm going to share a couple of slides to kind of revisit what we did in the past, but also to help you see kind of where I would recommend you go moving forward, okay? And so what that entails is first, there's kind of 3 things we want to talk about. So one is, what is the board and staff priorities? And I have kind of 4 that I want you to kind of think about. So I'm going to push you to kind of narrow that focus. I'm also wanting to push you to think about, how do you make decisions? And then what are those timelines that you have with regards to this type of work? So that's going to be really important, your decision-making process moving forward. And then also, how do you communicate and outreach specifically to your diverse community where you need to hear their voices and really ensure that people know the work that's happening? How do you communicate more effectively? So those are kind of the 3 things we're going to do now. And so specifically, what I want to do is share how your equity-driven governance really should be looking like now. These are some of the things that I recognize in working with you all. So one is your practices. So again, reminder, like these are kind of the 3 big things. You oversee the budget. You have to be fiscally responsible. You obviously create policy. You're the board, right? You create and monitor those policies. And then of course you work together as a board. So those are your practices, right? But most specifically, what I want you to think about is your policy. You are policy makers. And I'm going to push you to think about your policies in 4 what I call buckets, right? 4 buckets. So teaching and learning, human resources, budget, and climate. And these are ones that, based on effective governance, are the things that should rise to the top when you talk about your governance work and you prioritizing your time. Okay, these are very important. The community needs to know that these are very important and that anything that comes to the board is really in the lens of prioritizing our policy. What should always come to the top is what's happening in those classrooms, teaching and learning. Human resources is your staffing, right? And then of course your budget, you have to be fiscally responsible. And then of course the climate really falls around what we call school climate, discipline, safety. That's what that piece refers to. Now, one thing that's interesting for you all, which is the case for many boards, I don't want to pick on my San Mateo Foster City board, but you have a lot of hot topics, right? You have a lot of priorities. And so some of those I listed here, ethnic studies, because I remember you shared that with me, that one is one that's kind of what I call a hot topic. It's happening in the moment, right? Your safety SRO piece, I know that's one. The College Park concern around some of the dialogue from some of the community members that came up. Reopening of schools. I know Joan is like, please don't say that word again out loud, right? Reopening schools, like every district right now, superintendent in particular, they are pulling their hair out with everything that's going on. So I just want to say that is a hot topic. And then the other one is, of course, institutional racism, which we talked about earlier, right? Lots of districts in particular, and I know it's a hot topic for you all as well. Now, what does all this mean? Well, you all have a lot more on your agenda right now. And you remember this slide the last time we met in October. So I shared this with you before, and this was just kind of a list of things that that you have on your list, on your plate. And we could add to this list. I'm sure Joan is like, there's more, we can add more slides, but these are the things that really rose to the board level. Okay, so what I want you to think about today is how are we going to take these items and really focus them into what I call 4 lanes or 4 buckets, 4 ways to think of this work. Okay, and the way that I shared earlier was here's how the 4 buckets look. And I'm giving you a couple of examples when you think about your work and when you're doing your next study sessions, that your study sessions are really narrowly focused on, do things fall in these areas, these 4 priority areas? When things come across our board desk, how do we ensure that they are part of our priority? So priorities for human resources, again, recruitment, very important. The board is oversees the personnel policy. So it is important. You have a hiring framework. You don't necessarily do the hiring process, but you set the vision and kind of, obviously you approve hires. But thinking about what does that look like? Recruitment, hiring, retention, those are all important things that the board recognizes under human resources. Teaching and learning, just giving you a couple of examples, right? Culturally relevant instruction, very important. You may even say curriculum adoption could show up on that. The ethnic studies piece definitely could show up in that piece around teaching and learning. Rigor, I know that's a big deal, to ensure we have rigorous instruction. Grading may come up. Staff-student relationships, those are all things that come up. Your budget, obviously salaries, right? You have 85, 90% of your budget goes to salaries. Definitely that's a priority for you. Your school facilities probably will show up on this space. Your professional development, where you allocate your funding. So when you think about what is that last 15% of your budget, is it focused on equitable allocation to the kids who need it the most? So that's really when you think about how do we prioritize our budget. The last part, school climate safety. So your SROs, the police in schools, disproportionate discipline, your school to prison pipeline conversation. This is all where it falls in this particular space. Okay, so what I want to do is ask you to think about some of the questions that as a board, you may think about, okay, in our role as a board, how do we collaborate with our staff to really monitor and measure our priorities? So here's a couple of questions, which I've shared even last time, like what are those questions board members should ask, right, of the staff, right? So that the staff is prepared and ready to address the needs of the board. And also so that the board does, again, I have that picture of that clock at the top again, right? Reminding you that this is where you monitor the outcomes. You ask questions based on how that policy has really impacted your particular outcomes for kids. And so any questions that you have for your staff, right, really should be aligned with your priorities is what the spirit of this is. And this in itself, for many boards find that this is where your board meetings start to be a little shorter. Your board meetings start to be more concrete when you're doing your agenda builders, right? Like these things should be kept in mind. How do you prioritize your work based on those areas? Okay. And so last piece is I want to allow Joan, and maybe before we jump to this, Joan, maybe allow the board to ask questions about those priorities. But I want to have Joan really share a little bit about where the staff has kind of prioritized its work and where it really aligns with the priorities that I'm recommending for your board. So before Joan jumps in, and I'll stop sharing my screen, but for the governance team, want to just see what questions or thoughts might you have around prioritizing your work in these 4 areas. Tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking or what questions you may have. And I can go back to other slides as well. This one may be a little bit helpful too. Questions, thoughts before Joan jumps in.
Just going back to the previous slide of things that we should be asking.
Oh, got it.
I think if we are all in alignment with, yeah, these are the things we should be asking, then the staff can expect, like what they need to present or what they need to be always thinking about as well. Just to help.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's part of, and I put that clock at the top left-hand corner for a reason to remind us about creating a culture, right, for the board where it works well for the board and the staff. So board members might say, hey, I read the packet, right? I understand kind of what's going on, but I have all these questions. Right. And in some cases, I even say some board members don't always read their packet. So then they have more questions, right, for staff. And so this is one where I always say, board members, read your packet, right? But these questions are really more centered around equity-driven work, right? So this is what helps staff be able to be prepared and also the best use for staff time, right? I mean, the reality is that everything that board members are asking, and you all have a lot of priorities, that means the staff is going to have a lot they have to do. So you want to make sure that they can expect to be presenting in ways that inform the board, right, based on priorities. And that's going to be really important as well, which really helps them to prepare, but also not to feel as overwhelmed. Right. And it creates a culture of trust, a culture of just like transparency. Like it's pretty powerful. So that's absolutely, Rebecca, you hit it spot on. Other thoughts about this or questions you have about priorities, maybe about even the 4 priorities. Go ahead, Ken, jump in.
It's sort of like, I think that this is all really good in terms of where we're going and what we want to do. I feel like there's like the biggest elephant in the room, which is one of the hot topics, which is the reopening of schools. And in a lot of ways, it's, a lot of things that we think about, when we think about like reopening and like having PPE, do we have the budget for this? So how's human resources, all these things that fits within these categories. Yeah. But it's also very difficult to think about like almost anything else, but like, how are we going to get, our kids back in school? And it's been a really tough year. And it's sort of hard to sort of like we just add more things. And I want to, I feel like according to like Newsom's press conference and everything else and our county conference or calls, it's like there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but we're not there yet. And so like, I know I'm going to talk about these questions, but I still like, it's like big elephant room is reopening schools. And I think it's hard right now.
Yeah. Well, Ken, can I offer this? And I really appreciate you saying this because I didn't share this earlier. one of the reasons why when training boards, we provide this context of prioritizing the work is that there's always going to be hot topics, right? There's always going to be hot topics. That's the nature of humans, right? And so there's always going to be something. There's never a smooth moment where you can just, focus on something and it never be an interruption. So the point of this is actually to help you stay laser focused on the big picture, right? Because what will happen is with COVID-19, and a school shooting, there's all these different things that come up for schools, right? That are tragic. But what happens is if we kind of move with wherever the wind blows, what I call it, right? The wind blows here, we focus on that. The wind blows there, we focus on that. Then what happens is our work as an equity-driven board gets lost. So I do want to say one caveat. COVID-19 is an unprecedented moment in education, right? So I do want to acknowledge what you're saying is that this is different. But I also want to say your 4 priorities, if this is how you want to look at this as a board, it actually coincides well with reopening schools. Because guess what? Your staff, and you'll see Joan will probably show in a moment, guess what? Your staff has to consider budget with reopening schools, right? You got to consider your human resources, right? How FTE looks, who has to, there's all these adjustments, the teaching and learning piece, what that looks like. School safety, even though it's online, like there's all of these things fall into these priorities. So hopefully that helps a little bit with that context. Good. Okay. So you all ready to let Joan kind of jump in and give a little more context of kind of how the staff has really prioritized its work? I think the spirit of this in the last session was to really understand a little bit more about what the staff kind of does, right? And because you have this laundry list of what I call initiatives, which lots of districts do, it's important to get context of what the staff does so you can better envision how do you create the vision for the work in your district. So Joan, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and let you have access to that screen.
Actually, it's Diane's going to take over.
Oh, perfect.
And show the presentation. And while she's queuing that up, I just want to say that I am pleased to bring you this update on strategic initiatives in the district for the 2020-2021 school year. These initiatives are have been determined to move our district forward. They're progressive, they're equity-based. I'm going to show the initiatives in the same 4 categories that Nicole Anderson just presented in teaching and learning, climate, staffing, and fiscal. We're going to go through a slide presentation, and then Diane created an Excel spreadsheet. The Excel spreadsheet is going to be much easier for you to read as far as who's involved with each of the different items. Before we begin, I do want to recognize that these strategic initiatives would move more easily and more quickly if we were not contending with COVID-19. And that is just as Ken mentioned in his presentation. To that point, I would like to focus your attention on COVID-19. That's the next slide. And I'm going to hope that someone can help me with this dog so that you don't have to listen to it barking crazily. Let's see if I can get a grandkid come and pick him up. Okay. So the overriding situation has been the emergency management of COVID-19, and it has required sustained high levels of attention capacity throughout the entire organization in order to recreate education in distance learning and then hybrid learning to a full return. And so I just gave you some of the buckets just to give an example of what's going on throughout the organization. When this first happened, of course, we had tech distribution and the ongoing management and support just related to being able to connect. Child nutrition had to change their manner of producing meals. We did keep preschool going. We got Annex started up. We did summer school. Then, of course, we had distance learning. We knew from spring that we had to do a lot of work around distance learning because it wasn't as successful as we expect of ourselves. So we had new curriculum, new lessons, all the PD, all of the work that site staff had to do to really implement distance learning. And then now we're monitoring that the student progress. That's requiring all different kinds of ways to assess. We wrote and implemented the 1-year learning continuity and attendance plan. We're prepping for the hybrid return. We're doing health protocols. We have staff and student choices have been made now for distance learning or return, and we're making class lists. We've negotiated 4 MOUs, still in process. There's budget management of all of this. There's been enormous amount of communication through a variety of channels, and then just ongoing forms and reports and updates that have been due literally every other week. We're sending in other reports or new ways we have to account for things. So, this is not where we would normally spend our time. But if we don't spend our time on this, we're going to lose our kids. So we are working on this to do the very best we possibly can under the circumstances. Now, the real work that we had intended to move forward with are the next focus areas. And initiatives with an asterisk, those things need to be completed within this school year. So despite all that's going on, these things have to be completed. Now, if the focus area does not, if the initiative does not have an asterisk, it could continue into the new year, so into the next school year. Now, our district staff takes the perspective that all of these initiatives have a direct or indirect equity focus. And we have identified items with a plus that we feel have a very direct equity focus. So this is not an exhaustive list. I'm giving you buckets of work. And I also want to tell you that we've identified who leads the work and who's involved. So ES is Ed Services, SS Student Services, HR Human Resources, B for Business, Site Staff, that means the organization. There's a lot on the site, principals and the teachers to implement these different actions. So in the teaching and learning, we have to implement the actions that we have stated in the 2020-2021 Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan. You've seen it, you approved it, it's rigorous. That goes throughout the whole organization. Ed Services holds that. We have to write another one this spring. Another one has to be written for the 2020-2023. So it has to go on through, it has to incorporate what was done this year. There's quite an elaborate format for it. We have to continue to support the efforts of our sanctuary task force and support the needs of English learners throughout the district. This is a mandate. This has to be done. This has to continue. Now, the work of the equity task force, it doesn't have to be done this year. It's work that we want to do this year that can continue into next year. Very direct equity focus. And our social studies materials. We want to do something this spring, but it will move into next year. That's the social studies materials, the ethnic studies. Now we also, there's 2 slides to teaching and learning. We have to work on our special education program. We have a CCEIS project. You're going to hear about it at the next meeting. We've presented the plan. It's been accepted. And now we have a 27-month rollout. We have a program improvement audit that came in that we're working on. And that needs to happen this year. We are doing contract reviews and budget tracking. Those things all have to happen this year. And as you know, these are some of our most vulnerable learners. Now, we won't be building the new school in North Central this year, but we do need to determine the design options. So you just approved the consultant agreement with Pedro Noguera. He's an outstanding leader in the education field. He will be helping us with that design. That part needs to happen or we can't move forward. We also have made commitments to work with College Park in the immersion program. We have also made commitments with Parkside's Montessori for the middle years. The middle years starts next year. So we made those commitments. Those things have to happen this year. Now our preschool structure that we mentioned, We've put it in place. We want to continue to review the progress. That can happen now and into next year. The magnet programs, that can happen now and into next year. Let's look at climate. Climate, managing the stress of COVID-19. We have a lot of work we're doing through cell programming and the counselors. We have new counselors. In all of our schools, we have counselors, but we have a lot of new counselors. So we're working to ensure their support and make sure that they can support others. We're continuing to, now that has to happen now. Now working with the Equity Task Force on implementing strategies on LGBTQ. Some of those things can happen now, but it can continue. Working with Nicole and the Equity Task Force, we can begin working on our SRO resolution and move it into next year also. We've done the listening sessions. We've seen some of the information where we have a staff listening session planned, but we do not have SROs on campus right now. We're not implementing discipline the way that we do in a brick and mortar sense, so we have some time. Now we do need to continue to develop our communication program. As you know, communication has been intense over this past year, and we need to continue to work on that and ensure that we are successfully reaching all of our families. And I do know that part of that, that's why it has a plus on there, is that we need to continue to look at how we're reaching out to those of our families who don't as easily connect. How do we ensure that they're receiving the information that they need? And I know that's some work that the Sanctuary Task Force is doing with Diane and others. So we will continue to work on that. Now, climate is also facilities, and we have made commitments. We have commitments to finish the last 2 of the 3 gyms. We made a commitment to finish the new school, Beach Park Elementary in Foster City. They're supposed to move in the new year. And then we do have other work that will continue into next year. The new school in North Central San Mateo, the MPRs at George Hall and Sunnybrae design work has started, but it won't be completed at this year. Bowdage updates, they'll start. And then we do have our Measure T, which we're very, very thankful for. And I do have a star by Health and Safety. Health and Safety, we're starting now. And then of course you do have to hold CBOC and parcel tax meetings, that's required. So there's no choice about that. Staffing. I put LMI under this. It's really an opportunity for us to talk with all of our constituents across our district. You know, our mission was to communicate, collaborate, and engage in shared decision-making. And that is an important structure that over the years has become stronger and stronger. And we need to continue to work on that. We need to continue to work with our labor leaders on reopening plans. We need to negotiate the calendar for next year. I mean, because of all of the other things, we haven't had a chance to do that. That has to happen. We need to support our new teachers. It's hard to be a new teacher in this venue. So we really have, we always do. We have an induction program, but we're really pushing this to make sure that they are supported in this very strange year. Now, again, with the Equity Task Force strategies, they can be done this year and move on. There are 3 that have basically come out of the conversations that the Equity Task Force Staffing Subcommittee have engaged in, and those things are starting. So those are the 3 listed below, engaging with Elder to support the recruitment hire of special ed teachers with a focus on diversity, engaging with San Jose State University to support the recruitment and hire of bilingual teachers and speech and language pathologists, focus on diversity. And again, another engagement with San Jose State on supporting classified staff to move to degree completion. So those are things that we are doing now. And then budget, we have to manage a very complicated budget. We have to produce a first interim, second interim, and estimated actuals. We have to finalize and report on the COVID expenditures. We have donations, we have grants, we have state funding, federal funding, and supplemental funds. Those have to be accounted for. We have used reserves to ensure the ongoing programming of our preschool and annex programs, in order to support our most vulnerable students. And because of that, we have to plan for the deficits that will be evident in those programs in the upcoming year. Again, child nutrition has taken a hit also. We have to monitor their funding to ensure stability. We have now, not as urgent, but important, track the facilities expenditures related to L, X, and T, and the parcel tax expenditures related to V. In summary, staff have prioritized the work related to the emergency management of educating students and supporting the staff during this situation, COVID-19. We've also prioritized work that must continue during this school year. These are strategic initiatives. They were delineated with that asterisk. Now, without an asterisk, those are things that are in process and expected to continue into the next school year. So before we go into questions, I just wanted to show it to you on an Excel spreadsheet because it'll be easier for you to track. And then I did ask Executive Cabinet to come. These are held by their different divisions and they can respond to questions. So Diane, can you show that Excel sheet? And we will make this available to you.
Can you see it okay?
Yes, I do see it just fine. Do you want to explain? Diane did this for me. I really appreciate the time you spent taking all of those pieces and putting it in. Do you want to explain how it's laid out?
Sure. Everyone, it essentially takes every bullet point on Dr. Rosa's slides and gives you just a visual way to see who's involved. And those X's with bold are those who are primarily responsible or accountable. You'll see some teams that work together jointly to share responsibility, and I've identified those with you'll see bold under different departments, but it essentially just takes all of that and gives you one visual way to look at it. And also you'll see the current year asterisk, as well as those that Dr. Rosa's and the team felt had a direct equity focus. And so it's just laid out in one more visual way to look at it. And as you like, please let me know, Dr. Rosa's, and I'll advance it. So
sure, why don't you go ahead and just slowly show how you took each of those pieces and laid it out, and then we can make it available.
Okay, so here's, you can see the emergency management of COVID-19 and the engagement through, pretty much every department. Although not every department has primary responsibility for every area, there's a lot of collaboration and teamwork. There's a significant number of meetings each week to advance the process, and you get a visual from there. As I move to teaching and learning, you can see there's very heavy collaboration between education services and student services with support by human resources and business. Climate student services bears a very heavy load on this part, as well as business and their responsibilities for facilities and the development of the new facilities. Staffing obviously falls significantly to human resources with, again, a lot of collaboration. I think that's really the name of the game right now, is collaboration and support for one another. But then again, a budget is primarily business with teamwork through ed services, student services, and HR.
Okay, so I'll turn it back to Nicole and any questions the staff is here to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. I think it's powerful, and just appreciate, taking the time to really help the governance team recognize how their priorities, if, looking at these 4 buckets, like how does this look for staff when you go back to the role of the staff and superintendent role of the board. And so I can see some next steps that will really help the board, and I'll share those in a little bit, but I think it's great for them to ask questions, especially having your prestigious executive cabinet here on a Saturday, I think this would be a great opportunity for the board to engage with the staff on questions you have around the priorities of your equity-driven governance work.
And actually, Nicole, our board knows all of these things inside and out. I mean, these are all, it's nothing new to them.
Right.
It's all work that they know is going on, and but you may have questions about where we are with certain things. So, you know, happy.
Yeah, and I think the board,
to
I want to let the board kind of win, because I think that
Sure.
there's a lot to keep.
Yeah, there is a lot.
While they've been exposed to that, seeing it all in one space, actually, it's pretty powerful. But
Yeah.
I do think this is a great opportunity to ask any clarifying questions
Right.
about the work. And again, I want to keep in mind the lens of your equity work, right, as a governance team is really important. But questions to the staff about the prioritization of the work.
Would you like Diane to put the Excel up?
I don't know. Kenneth, go ahead and jump in. What questions may you have?
Sure. So just one clarifying question from the Equity Task Force, Alder. What is Alder versus San Jose State? Is that you may have mentioned it before in a different meeting, but I'm not sure who Alder is.
So Alder is a graduate school program for credentialing, and we are working with them. They're a little bit different because we are working with them on a teacher residency program. So typically when teachers get their credentials, they will go to a teacher credential program, and then they have student teaching, which is often short term. But in a teacher residency program, the candidate really is in the classroom. They'll be in the classroom 4 days a week.
Yeah.
And they'll be working very, very closely, a lot of co-teaching with the mentor teacher. We're being very selective about who those mentors are, but it's our first partnership with the teacher residency program. And we just feel that it just provides superior training and preparation for a teacher versus doing your typical teacher credential program with a few weeks of student teaching. So we're super excited. We had our first interviews, and so what the district is doing is they are working, Alder is working in partnership with San Mateo County Office of Ed, and the district is participating in that program. And so we had the opportunity to interview candidates, and you know, surprisingly and unsurprisingly, many of them want to work in our district, which is fantastic. And they, you know, we're focused on educators of color in our special ed program, and we are hoping to have 5 or more start in our schools next year as teacher residents. And we are getting ready to meet with our principals, but we would like to cluster our candidates so they have support from one another, and that our principals can work together. And so we are looking to have our candidates placed in our inclusion schools, which are George Hall, Meadow Heights, Laurel, and then also Foster City, because one of our one of our paraeducators wanted to be in the program, and he's working in Foster City. So we're really excited about the opportunity for this. It really meets 2 of our needs. One is around special education instructors, and secondly, our goal to really diversify our workforce.
Great. No, thank you. I just I was not familiar with the program or the I wasn't sure if it was a term of art or something else like that. So, thank you for that presentation. I remember the last time we had these sort of priorities discussion. You know, I remember asking about, like, wait, I'd love to see a breakdown of each department, and so showing where, you know, aligned with what the topic is, so we know who's actually taking the lead and where who's working on what. So I think that the Excel chart is actually very helpful for us. I'm just wondering, I'm a little unclear in terms of the sort of the hot topics and items that was in Nicole's slides in terms of priorities, and then the priorities that are shown in the Excel chart. Are we sort of determining this next year's priorities right now, or is this more of a confirmation? I'm just a little sort of unclear on that.
So I'm not sure that Nicole and I were completely in sync on this, but it was surprising to me to see that you had written the same hot topics that are involved in our strategic initiatives. So we had not talked about this. So the ethnic studies, as you saw, was under the social studies adoption. Safety and SRO, that's in the, there's a line item for that. The College Park, there's a line item for that. Reopening of schools, well, there's a whole slide on that. Now, institutional racism, as far as that goes, I mean, that has to be unpacked. And I think that part of what we've been talking about is you're doing learnings. We're going to need to talk about, well, we're bringing our administrators into more learning. There is some site work that's going on. We have work going on, you know, throughout the organization. I think we need to get much more strategic about what does that mean in this district. So I would think that all of the initiatives do address issues of equity throughout our organization. But if you want to hit that particular topic, institutional racism, there's probably a great deal of work that needs to go into that piece and the communication around that. So that might be something that Nicole would like to pick back up.
Yeah, absolutely, Joan. It's funny you said, you know, we didn't really talk about it, but what's interesting is I have, you know, I've been with you all for a little while and I've listened to the hot topics, the things that continue to come up. And the whole purpose of that was really just to highlight like the things that are in your face right now, right? And that you do have to address because they're in the moment. But the purpose of the priorities was to help move you all in a direction and push you to think about how you narrow your focus as a board so you can really effectively address the needs of kids based on equity, right? And that's the spirit of this. So while Joan shared that priorities based on how the staff, you know, is doing the work specifically, I think that is very helpful for you to see, like, here's how it looks on the ground level. My recommendation as a next step, and I'm going to use Sue's response to your question, Kim, because I think it was a perfect example, right? Is how did you see equity in the work that the staff is doing, right? Because remember, I'm here talking about governance with an equity lens. So for example, when Sue shared that piece about Alder, what a great example, right? And I got all excited because I know Alder. I'm actually got to work with them, and one of my really close friends and colleagues is an associate dean there. And because so I know that their role in your priority is huge because I know what they do in that teacher prep program. They are very specific about addressing teachers around not only recruitment of teachers of color, but also teachers who are culturally proficient. And that's really important when you talk about that staffing bucket, right? Which then goes into your priority. And let me just put it back on the screen. And also goes into the teaching learning priorities, right? So it actually kind of fits too. And so the Alder one is a great example. And so as a board, when you think about the question that should come up for you is, how does this, you know, how does Alder align, right? This practice of using Alder and partnering, how does it align with our equity work? It totally aligns, right? And so that's where you should feel like, okay, this is our role as a board to really unpack. Our district is doing great work, but how do we know that, right? Without one, you hearing that presentation from Joan and from Sue, but also asking the question to make sure, is this aligning with our equity work? And that particular example, absolutely, right? And so that's where I want you to all see yourselves going moving forward, Ken, to your point about, so are we prioritizing everything now in terms of strategies for next year? And so today, no, that's not your official, like, you know, study session for that. But what I do recommend is you all think about how do you take these 4 priorities and actually utilize study sessions to unpack each of these, because there's a lot in each bucket, right? So your study session should always be focused on your priorities, right? And obviously hot topics are going to create needs for study sessions, which is fine. You need that time, but I want you all to just think about, if we're going to be an effective governance team to address equity, we're going to have to be very laser focused on a systemic change in these areas that affect education, which happen to be your budget, which is a big deal, right? Your staffing is a big part of it. Your teaching and learning, what happens in those classrooms at the school, huge. And obviously the climate of your school is huge. And if you really stay focused on these, you can see all the work Joan shared. the work is happening, right? So when you start feeling like I got to pick up another priority, if it's not part of this priority, we're not going to put a lot of energy into it, because here's what'll happen. Again, the wind is going to blow. And so you got to recognize, is this a hot topic or is this one of our priorities? And that's what's going to help you stay focused and effective. It'll help the staff feel like they can continue to focus on what they want to do based on the vision that you set as the board. I hope that helps a little bit about that work. And just again, thank you, Joan, for giving a little context. So any other questions or thoughts? I want to, make sure we end with just a quick retouch of, I don't want to reiterate your last board meeting where Carla and I got to present about the community listening sessions, but I do want to just make sure you had an opportunity to regroup on that and had a couple of reminders about next steps for the SRO resolution. But before we go to that, questions or any other questions for the staff or Joan before we go to the—
I don't have a question. I just kind of have a comment, and it kind of builds off of what you were just saying. I think in addition to the study sessions, I think just thinking about how we can clarify or structure kind of these all these initiatives and kind of presentations in board meetings too, like how and in communication, right, both to the board and to the community, right? So knowing that this is a through line, just being really intentional about how it shows up in our agendas, how we're categorizing it, how we're communicating it, and being really, because I think it not only does that help to just communicate this work in a consistent way, but it also just helps to keep it really systematic and structured, so that it feels as aligned as it actually is, right? Because I think when we talk about it like over here and over here and over here, it doesn't necessarily always feel cohesive. And I actually feel like it is in a lot of ways. I mean, there's of course ways that we can continue to streamline and all of that, but there is a lot of work that's happening focused around, the vision setting. And so we just need to be really clear around how we talk about that, and how our agendas prioritize that, and how our communication re-emphasizes that. So.
Yeah, Shar, you were reading my mind in kind of transitioning to our last conversations. One of the things that I wanted to share is there is also a need, I think, in your future study sessions, not only to focus on, use a study session just for one of these priorities, but also to use these priorities to do your agenda building process, right? So that it is very streamlined with the work you're doing. So I think that's important. But also the piece about communication and outreach is important, right? So how is this communicated to the people you want to hear these messages, right? And the board meetings are one way. It's a huge platform for you. So absolutely using your agenda, it is a form of communication, right? So you do want to make sure it's very streamlined and aligned. But the other piece is really spending additional time in future study sessions, just talking about how are we going to make decisions moving forward? How are we going to prioritize our work? What is that timeline that is going to exist in terms of, okay, we make a decision, and I want to use kind of this transition of like the SRO resolution, right? So we make a decision, we come up with a resolution, we come up with this particular decision, we vote, and then there's a timeline that kicks in, right? So having the opportunities to really wrestle with what is going to be a good timeline and feasible for everyone, knowing the priorities, right? That they're aligning with the priorities, but also recognizing that, are we ready for whatever decision we make? Are we ready to go into implementation? And that's going to be really important as well. And so I know you all have a consensus building process. I'm not going to go into all the logistics of that, but just really being thoughtful about what decisions you make moving forward, so that they're very thoughtful, that all 5 of you are on the same page, right? And even if, go back to the readiness, let's say that there's 3 of you are like, you know what, I really like this, and there's 2 of you are like, oh, I'm not sure. Maybe it's okay to table things, go back to it, discuss it more, and then let's bring it back for action later. And I have to remind boards of that a lot, because remember, the energy to do certain work right now is like super urgent, but sometimes if it's urgent, it's based on like a passion, it's based on emotions, but it's not necessarily based on we have enough information, then sometimes it'll push our timeline to go even faster, and we're not really ready. And so I'm saying that to a lot of boards more recently, because again, the energy around institutional racism, Obviously, even around COVID, and around all of the hot topics sometimes pushes us to make quick decisions. So how you make decisions, just be reminded of that. And I think a future study session would be recommended, right? That you think about how do we come up with our decisions, right? And if we aren't off, and this goes back to consensus, right? It's about, I always push boards. You want everybody to be on the same page, down to who you hire as a superintendent, down to the smallest decision you make as a board. You want everybody to be on the same page. But there are times when everyone's not, and that's okay. But at least we know that we have an understanding of what we're doing together moving forward. And there's a lot of great examples that you all have experienced, that other boards have experienced, where sometimes like we made a decision and went a little bit quick, so then the timeline kind of got in the way. So now it gets a little messy moving forward, or we haven't wrestled with like our complete readiness as a board to move. So what I want to do is give you a couple of recommendations. There was our self-care slide. I don't know, it was way at the end. Take a deep breath. That's one recommendation, right? Self-care is huge. But I want to remind you of how can you effectively leverage the task force. So remember, your priorities, the great news is your task force has the same priorities, right? There's 3 focus groups. I shouldn't even say focus groups. There are 3 task force subcommittees who are focused on safety, staffing, as well as teaching and learning, right? And their titles for it, kind of vary, but they all have the same priorities. They just don't have the budget piece, which is really not their responsibility anyway. So the great news is you can leverage the task force to actually continue to unpack some of these priorities where you may, as a board, go, okay, I need a little bit more understanding of this work, right? My job is not to do the work, it's to set the vision. So again, leveraging the task force, and I say effectively because remember, what we don't want to do is go outside of our priorities, and because a hot topic comes up, then the equity task force now becomes what we call a focus group, right? And so that's something that also is happening a lot with groups like that, right? Is there's a hot topic, so then we want to get input from the task force, or people have equity committees, you name it, and so it becomes a focus group versus let's stay focused on what the task force work is, which is long-term. Let's create a plan of action around your 3 priority areas, which is staffing, school climate, and academics, teaching and learning, right? They are in that space. So I want to just encourage you all to just continue to support them and allow them to continue to unpack some of those challenges, which is where they're at now. They're starting to unpack, gather data, start to look a little bit more at how do we create actions that we can bring to the board at the end of the school year. So I want to remind you of that group, and then remind you of some of the things with regards to your SRO resolution. And this was all stuff that was shared with you at that last board meeting. I think Noelia, I think that was the meeting you were not able to attend. And so I really want to make sure that I just put this in here so that you were able to see. And that slide, I think that slide deck, hopefully you have access to. Yeah, but this is just kind of a recap. And so the main thing I want to bring you to is not the purpose and process. You all know that, but the next steps and recommendations. So I want to make sure you continue to think about more listening sessions. I know there's another one on December 16th, which will be the staff. So that's going to be helpful. Also outreach to diverse stakeholders. So that's something that was that was expressed when we gave that presentation, but also something that I want to reiterate is that we have to continue to do better outreach to, again, diverse means multiple perspectives so that we can really get good data. Continue to provide professional development. Excited that, we're going to be working with your site and district leadership. Excited to also hear that you have Dr. Pedro Noguera, another mentor and colleague that I look up to, who's going to support the opening of your the programmatic piece of your new school. But also continue as a board to examine your data, your policies, your practices. So continue to do that, okay, with your equity statement in mind. Again, leverage the task force. I just mentioned that. Again, redefining the relationship with the police. So although the SRO resolution is kind of like, it is what it is. They have been terminated, right? There's no SRO on campus. But keep in mind, when you do reopen schools, we don't know what's going to come forward moving. So you do want to revisit, like, okay, what does that relationship mean? What does it look like to have safety on our campuses? And then, of course, there's going to be that piece around revising or revisiting the discipline matrix, which I can see the task force supporting some of that work, but I also know the school sites are going to have to be a huge part of that because they are the ones that actually live in that kind of discipline matrix work and the safety plan. So I wanted to just give that last piece around the resolution and see if there's any additional questions after that board meeting. Like I said, I don't want to rehash this again because you're at the end of your study session time, but I do want to make sure that if there were any additional things that came up around your next steps for your SRO resolution, this would be an amazing opportunity to share before we go into our next work with the task force subcommittee, who's going to continue the work, by the way. So any questions, thoughts? Now. No, we're good. Okay, no questions, no thoughts about it. Okay. You're like, the board meeting was enough, right? Although the best part of your board meeting was our students speaking up, I tell you. It's like, if they were a little older, I would hire them in a heartbeat to work with me, I tell you. No offense to you, Joan, or anyone run the district, but I tell you, those kids can run a district. They can do it. They had some profound things to say. I would just always get excited working with kids. So definitely more study sessions with kids. I'm sorry, listening sessions. All right, last but not least. Oh, hi, Kaya, cutie pie. She's like, who's this lady making all this noise? If I knew how to sing, I would start singing to her, but that wouldn't work. So last but not least, next steps. Where are we going from here? Is one, continue to conduct your study sessions together. Again, this is the gift that board members have to give to themselves outside of your normal like governance meetings. Like, you need this time to just study, ask questions, get more information. So continue to create your study sessions. Okay, I know you don't want to add more to your calendar, but you should at least be having one a month focused on your priorities, right? Like, keep unpacking those priorities. And those will actually help in your board meetings, your regular board meetings, where your agendas won't be so long because you have done a lot of that studying together in the study session. So I would highly recommend that those board study sessions be around your priorities. I would also recommend that you think about, when I say equity policy and also equity impact plan, that your 4 priorities that we kind of talked about today and that I'm recommending, that you create a plan around those priorities, right? So that the board really can continue as you have more people coming on, you have new board member coming on soon, you'll have, future board members coming. So you want to set like kind of a blueprint for what the board is doing. Okay, not the LCAP, right? It's an alignment with LCAP. The LCAP is not the board's plan. Okay, so how are you going to create steps as a board to ensure that your equity work happens? Okay, our next study session, I would highly recommend on our agenda that an application of your equity statement continue to be a part of this. So how are you actually applying your statement to the work? How are you applying your lens to the work? And that really should come out of some of the questions that you're asking the staff as you continue to practice what is equity actually mean as a governance team. Shara mentioned communication outreach. I want to reiterate that again, that you probably want to spend some time really fleshing out what is our communication plan specifically around outreach to your diverse stakeholders. I think that's an important one. And then also the mentioning of your agendas. As you're building your agendas, just remember to use your priorities to try to build that agenda so you all can stay really focused and aligned with the work. And I think everyone will then have kind of a common understanding of where we're moving forward. There's no surprises, right? And really have what we call an effective governance team that's leading for equity. So with that being said, I'm going to leave just for the community our information. Kevin and Shelly are my other teammates who get to work with you all. And Kevin's going to be working with the site and district staff. You all have met Shelly, who's worked with us with the task force and also the community listening sessions. They both wish you all well and think of you all often because this is such important work and we see such an intentionality. So, as a community, those that are listening and will watch this recording, we just again want to acknowledge the community, the work that's been done. We want to acknowledge the pain, the heartache, the challenge of this, but I'm so excited to be working with a board, a governance team who's serious about this work. And I'm really encouraged about the kids in the future for your district. So just, give yourselves kind of what I call a hand and a praise because you're doing some amazing work. And I know it feels hard and tough, but this is the work of educators to really interrupt inequities in the system. So I'm just honored to lock arms with you. And with that, I'm going to close and pass the mic back over to Joan. And just want to thank you all for hanging out with me a couple hours on a Saturday.
So I'd like to thank you, Nicole, because you help us focus on this work. I do want to take a moment and thank my board, because the time that they've spent since March, not only on managing COVID, but on really maintaining a focus on equity and moving these different initiatives forward, has been very involved. And I have to thank my cabinet and all the staff throughout our organization, because there is an alignment. There is an alignment between what we're saying at our board meetings and our actions and what our kids are receiving. We are not perfect, but we're definitely moving in the right direction, and people have put in a tremendous amount of additional extra effort this year. And I just have to appreciate what they've done to really keep our students in the forefront. So thank you to Nicole for helping us, our board, cabinet, site staff, the entire organization. We really appreciate it. So with that, I turn it back over to Noelia.
Thank you, Joan. Yeah, I just wanted to say real quick also that, I do think that our board, we started to have really explicit conversations about equity and disrupting, practices that weren't as equitable as they should be. But I really think that, our staff, once those conversations began, they have, sorry, my dog's freaking out now too. They have taken those opportunities and led the work in their day to day. And so I think as a board, we do recognize that, and we're just, we're excited for the work to continue. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to motion to adjourn to deal with the dog. Unless anybody else wants to say anything.
I just want to say thank you, Nicole. It's always a pleasure working with you.
Thank you. Okay, do I have a second on the adjournment?
Second.
Did you second, Shara? Okay, roll call vote, Trustee Chin,
Yes.
Trustee Hitchcock,
Yes.
Trustee Parker,
Yes.
Trustee Watkins, and a yes for me. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Kaya.